Welcome back, Netrunner fans, to part 2 of my 23 seconds review. In this part, we're going to be looking at all the Corp cards in the back. First up is a new piece of ice for HB. This is Fairchild 1.0. It's 1 to res, it's 1 influence. It's a 2 strength code gate Bioroid. Bioroid is the runner can spend clicks to break any subroutine on it. It has 2 subs. Both are the same. The runner must pay 1 credit or trash 1 of his or her installed cards. Well, this is a cute little Bioroid, one of the smallest that we've seen, and this one I think is a lot better than some of the other low-end Bioroids in that it's going to always do something. It's going to be a minor tax. This reminds me a lot of like Pup or Pop-Up Window or things like that, just this cheap, annoying little piece of ice that the runner's going to have to deal with. And I think that HB really needs code gates more than the other two, so this is probably going to be a little more playable than it would be if it was a different subtype. I don't really expect this to see a tremendous amount of play, but I do think it's pretty decent at 1 to res. The 2 strengths enough that it's not going to just get killed with Parasite, and it's got an impactful set of subroutines that the runner's going to have to do something about. Usually, I think just spending those 2 credits. Next up is another Bioroid piece of ice. This is Sherlock 2.0. It's a 7 to res, 3 influence, 6 strength Century Bioroid Tracer. The runner can spend 2 clicks to break up to 2 subroutines on Sherlock 2.0. It has 3 subs. The first 2 are Trace 4. If successful, add 1 installed program to the bottom of the runner's stack. And the last sub is Give the runner 1 tag. Well, the first thing that I thought of when I read this is how sad Sherlock 1.0 is. Sherlock 1.0, I think maybe saw occasional play as like a 1 or 2 of in a couple decks. But then once Vikram 1.0 was printed, I think there was virtually no reason to play Sherlock. This is a much better effort at the same sort of ice. Not only are the 2 traces much better in that they're going to put the program on the bottom instead of the top, that's pretty significant, but also it's going to have this give a tag. They can only double click through 2 of the subs, so like with most of the 2.0 Bioroids, they're probably going to have to suffer the consequences of 1 of the subs. When you consider that the original Sherlock was 6 to res and this is 7, why would you not just pay the 1 extra credit? This thing is infinitely better than the first one for that 1 extra credit. You get 1 more strength, 1 more sub, the subs are better, and it's a Bioroid too. Now realistically, this card is going to be up against like Assassin or the Ichis or maybe like Vikram 1.0. That's going to keep it out of at least as like a 2 or 3 of most decks, but I could definitely see this seeing play as like a 1 or 2 of as one of your higher end pieces of ice in a Glacier style HB. Next up is a new asset for Jinteki. This is Hobu Research Facility. It's 0 to res, it's 3 influence, it's 4 to trash, and it's unique. The first time each turn you reveal secretly spent credits, gain that many credits. If it's possible for a monster card to be printed for Nisei Division, I think this is it. I've pretty routinely said that Nisei Division is a bad idea, not only because you have to have enough card support for it, which I think the card pool largely has not had, but on top of that, you really have to go through this rigmarole to get that 1 credit, whereas you could just play like ETF and HB or the foods within faction just to get a credit basically every turn for almost no effort. Here's an economic tool that's really only going to work well if you're playing a deck that has a lot of side games. Now this is unique, so you're only going to have 1 res at a time. That's certainly going to limit it. You're going to have to play supplemental econ. It's not going to be the only way you're making credits. But as I've said through the last few reviews, we've seen more and more Psi Ice. I think there really is an emerging archetype within Nisei Division that could be reasonably competitive. The Psi Ice certainly get a lot better if you're getting credits from Nisei Division, and then on top of that you have this thing, which could potentially pay off really well as well. I like this a lot. I think this is the type of card that we really need to have to expand the breadth of Jinteki, and I don't really see this being all that usable outside of Nisei Division, but that ID has needed fuel for quite some time. Next up is a new piece of ice for Jinteki. This is Chrysalis. It's 3 to res, it's 2 influence, it's 1 to trash. It's a 2 strength Century AP. If Chrysalis is accessed from R&D, the runner must reveal it. When the runner accesses Chrysalis, he or she encounters it. Ignore this ability if the runner accesses it from archives. Then it has 1 sub, do 2 net damage. This is the second piece of ice that we've seen after Archangel, where the runner accesses it, they have to immediately encounter it. This one has an interesting twist though, that it now has a trash cost. And I think this is a really smart move. Now, one really important point of clarification, you can only trash the piece of ice using its trash cost if you're accessing it. So in other words, if you're encountering it during a run, you're not going to be able to trash it. It's only if you access it like out of R&D or HQ or something like that, where you're going to be able to pay the 1 to trash it. And that's of course going to be after you've encountered it. I'm really liking this for a small net damage oriented Jinteki deck. This is just another nasty thing you can put in R&D, but the big thing about this is that it's going to double as a piece of ice that you can use to defend your servers later on. Now, I would point out that this has the weakness that a vast majority of the Zap type ice have, which is that they get crushed by Mimic or by other efficient Sentry Breakers. This is certainly no exception. If they have a Mimic, they're just going to run over this for 1 credit. And the fact that they can also trash it out of R&D might make this not as nice of a choice as something that's a little more durable, like a Cortex Lock or something like that. This is a neat little piece of ice. I think it's expanding what's possible with ice, and I think this might see a little bit of play in like a PE style. Next up is a new upgrade for Jinteki. This is Georgia Amelyov. She's 1 to res, 3 to trash, she's 2 influence. She's an upgrade sysop, and she's unique. Whenever the runner makes a unsuccessful run on this server, do 1 net damage. 2 credits, move her to another server. The first thing I have to say is this move to another server thing. I wish that was on like a million other cards. Just the idea that you'd be able to move your sysops around, I think in general would make them a lot more playable. And I think that's just a really great mechanic that I would like to see on a wider range of upgrades and assets. Now, this thing with the poking them for 1 on unsuccessful runs, the first thing I thought of with that is the au revoir based economy. That deck makes tons of unsuccessful runs because it's based on jacking out, and this is a card that would punish them, make it a lot harder for them to do so. We also have a 3-for-1 agenda that just does that. I don't think that's really ever been considerable either. This card, it's going to be kind of tricky to use even if you include it as a hoser against au revoir. You're going to have credits to move it to the right server. Any server where you have an unres piece of ice is potentially a target for the snitch au revoir thing. That's a little tricky. You're not going to have enough of this card or enough credits that you're going to want to scoot it all over the place. The playability of this seems largely contingent on whether or not the jack-out style stuff becomes really competitive and popular, or whether there are other reasons why they'd be making unsuccessful runs on your server. So I don't know, I kind of want to hold off judgment on this until we see more where the metagame goes. Next up is a new asset for NBN. This is Watchdog. It's 0 to res, it's 4 to trash, it's 1 influence. The res cost of the first piece of ice you res each turn is lowered by 1 for each tag the runner has. This card is like what Shoot the Moon really wanted to be. and I think this is going to be a lot more playable than Shoot the Moon ever will be. Even if they just have a couple tags, that's going to make a lot of NBN ice really, really cheap. NBN on the whole has a low cost curve for their ice, so they're not going to have a million tags for this to be a huge value. If you're playing like a mid-season-y, tag ice oriented Glacier style, I think this is definitely a card to consider. I think this is going to be reasonably decent as a difficult to trash asset that's going to give you some value. And another thing that I immediately notice is that it's not unique. So if you do have multiples of these rezzed, it could let you res some very, very high-end ice, although NBN doesn't exactly have a ton of those. This is pretty decent. I think this is an interesting way to push tags as more of an economic tool, and I think this will see a little bit of play. Next up is a new operation for NBN. This is hard-hitting news. It's 3 to play, it's 2 influence, it's terminal, which means after you resolve this operation, end your action phase, play only if the runner made a run during his or her last turn, trace 4. If successful, give the runner 4 tags. This is a pretty interesting card, and I really like a lot of things going on with it. First of all, let's talk about terminal. This is a new mechanic that's being introduced with this pack, and it's basically the thing that when you play it, it ends your phase. That means that you lose all of your unspent clicks, and you're not going to be able to take any more actions that turn. This is going to, most importantly, mean that even if you land the 4 tags with this card, you're not going to be able to follow up by Scorched Earthing them. So this is going to be a card where, even if you hit them with the tags, they could hypothetically just pay 8 and ditch all of them next turn, and while it's going to be really expensive, it could prevent them from getting flatlined by Scorched. We've seen a lot of emerging like trace ice oriented taxing Glacier style NBN, and that's I think really a new archetype for the faction, even though it's pretty obvious to me that that was intended to be a archetype for the faction since Core Set. This card is going to play really nicely into a deck like that. It's just going to be a big expensive tracing thing. And if you already have some sort of bonus credits for tracing or some way to improve your tracing, this card is going to be absolutely monstrous. Now, the elephant in the room is that this card is up against mid-season replacements. And mid-season has been probably the main tag mechanism pretty much since the game's history, outside of breaking news, which I think works a little differently. Now, mid-season is definitely better than this card, even though it's substantially more expensive, just because you can land the tags and then follow it up with a strong play. But especially post-rotation, I think this is going to be a really interesting tag effect, and I think this is probably good enough to see play right away out of the pack. I love the idea of making tag cards like this that can't just immediately be combined with Scorched. I think this is a really smart way to do that kind of design, and I'm really anxious to see if there's emerging trace tag oriented NBN decks that don't even consider Scorched Earth. I think that we've already seen some of that, especially out of Sync lately, and I think this card is really going to push that sort of strategy with a variety of IDs. Speaking of IDs, the next card we have is a new ID for NBN. This is NBN Controlling the Message. It's a 45-12, and it's a Mega Corp. The first time the runner trashes an installed Corp card each turn, you may trace 4. If successful, give the runner 1 tag. This cannot be avoided. We've seen a lot of mass asset kind of things in NBN, even before mass assets were really popular with like IG and stuff like that. Just because with Near Earth Hub, you can spam out a lot of assets, that's going to give you a bunch of cards. Now, I think this is really one of the first major competitors for that sort of style in NBN, just because this is going to tax them extensively if they're trashing your assets. Aryabhata Tech seems like an absolutely perfect card for this ID. You're going to be able to put it in there with a bunch of other assets, use some Tracer Ice, and you can pretty routinely initiate traces to give you a chance at getting those successful ones. That's going to not only give you money, but it's going to force the runner to lose money, and that's really awesome in a very taxing-oriented style. This is an interesting ID. I imagine it's going to see some play right out of the pack, just because there's already a lot of great stuff to do with mass assets, with the Mumbad Temple sort of thing. And there's also a fair amount of trace-oriented assets that you can play that I think would fit with this style really well. Next up is a new agenda for Wayland. This is Crisis Management. It's a 3-for-1, it's security subtype. If the runner is tagged, Crisis Management gains when your turn begins, do 1 meat damage. Let's see, would I rather play Bioethics or this card? In classic Wayland fashion, we have an interesting and powerful ability tied to something that's basically impossible to play. It's a 3-for-1, that's going to be really hard to play in most Wayland decks. I could maybe see this in Argus Security, because with Argus, you're tempted to play a lot more agendas because of the ID power, and you also already have Underway, which I think is a pretty effective way to run the runner out of cards, and this could be a cool finisher for that kind of deck. Now I think realistically, this is going to be really hard to play. When you compare it to Bioethics, it just seems so tremendously bad. Not only does it have this conditional thing where they have to be tagged, but you also have to score a 3-for-1, and then you have to have that not get like turntabled or something like that. I have tried to play attrition damage decks, whether it be PE or Argus, pretty much as long as I've been playing Netrunner. And the thing with those strategies is that ever since Levy Lab Access was printed, that whole strategy has just been massively invalidated. Basically, if the runner plays 1 lab access and 1 same old thing, they can pretty often get the lab access off, and that's going to not only prolong the game for another 30 minutes, but it's also going to make it so that you probably can't do enough damage before the runner scores out. And unfortunately, I think this is another card that's just really going to play into a strategy that's invalidated by the runner playing a single copy of a card in their deck. Next up is a new operation for Wayland. This is Stock Buyback. It's 1 to play, it's 2 influence. It's terminal and it's a transaction. Terminal means after you resolve this operation, end your action phase. Gain 3 credits for each agenda in the runner's score area. Here's another card that I think would play really, really well into that Argus deck, or just any sort of deck that was playing lots of small agendas. The big thing about this is that you're going to want to be able to use it like in the early or mid game so that you can set up and get your ice rezzed. And this card is not going to do anything unless you play enough agendas where they're going to have access 1 or 2 early in the game. That basically means playing 3-for-1s as far as I can see. I think if you're playing like a standard like 10 agenda style deck, this is really not going to be worth it. It's worth pointing out that this would count stuff like Shiku or whatever, cards that aren't actually agendas but are added to the runner's score area as agendas. That might be okay. It's a nice touch that this is a transaction, so it works for core set Wayland. I don't know, this is an okay card. I could see this being reasonably decent in a deck that plays enough agendas. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a ton of decks that do that. The last card in the pack is a neutral asset. It's called Sandberg. It's 0 to res, it's 4 to trash, it's no influence, and it's unique. If you have at least 10 credits, each piece of ice has +1 strength for every 5 credits in your credit pool. Big ice good. Make ice bigger. This is an awesome thing for a glacier style. It's going to make your ice bigger, more taxing, just generally help you press your advantage. If you've already got quite a few credits, this is going to be something that's going to keep you ahead or make you get farther ahead. If you get one of these rezzed, especially in like RP, that's the first place my mind went with it. It's going to be really hard for the runner to deal with this thing. If they have to bump into one of your ice and then trash this stupid 4-cost thing, This could also make some of your lower end ice a little more survivable against like Parasite. That's pretty cool. I really like this card. I think the fact that it scales per credits is really the absolute biggest thing about it. And I think any deck that has a really robust economy and relies on taxing the runner with ice is definitely going to consider this card. That's going to do it for my review of 23 seconds. I think this is a sweet kickoff of the new Flashpoint cycle. I'm really anxious to see what happens with Terminal, and I absolutely love trashable ice, and it says in the rules pamphlet operations as well, so we're going to see trashable operations. That's super cool, and this pack just makes me anxious to see what we're going to get in the rest of the cycle. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to subscribe and give me a thumbs up, and let me know just how big you've gotten ice with Sandberg. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon for some more Netrunner stuff.